We're going to talk about economic indicators. This is going to be national economic indicators. If you want to put your finger on the pulse of the economy, you might want to pay attention to this briefing. It'll help your business in the long term. First, let's go over what GDP is, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is like the grade book for the economy. It consists of these four functions or four areas: consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. Consumption is 2/3 of the GDP. Now what consumption is, it's all the products and the outputs of all the production in America, plus all the services provided. So that is what the consumption portion of the GDP is. Investment isn't like investing into stocks or bonds or anything like that. It's actual businesses investing in business capital. You know, buying desks, chairs, or a second plant, another building. And then there's government expenditures, which is, you know, typical government expenditures. It's kind of self-explanatory. Net exports is the exports minus the imports. Usually, or at least in the past few years, this has been negative. Let's move on to the next slide. So what we have here is the gross domestic product. Now it says chained dollars seasonally adjusted at annual rates. So basically we have a quarterly data point for each one of these, and those quarterly data points are interpolated into a yearly number. So when it says, you know, $14 trillion in Q1, that's if we were at that rate for the whole year, and with all the algorithms and compounding that could go on, it would have amounted to $14 trillion that year. So that's just kind of an important little thing to know about these numbers. They're not exactly, it's not 14 trillion per quarter, it's annualized. And the chained dollars is part of, it's taking inflation into account and other things. Seasonally adjusted means when it's Christmas time or some other season that where you really expect high sales, well, those sales go through also an algorithm during that time frame, comparing it to the year before and the year before, and it's adjusted. So none of those things should really affect the GDP. Anyways, if you look on the far left-hand side at 2005 Q1, you're at about $14 trillion GDP. And on the very far right-hand side, at the top right, you're about $16.5 trillion. What's important about this graph is that little gray area, that's called a recession. A recession is defined as any two quarters that have a negative or a gross domestic product that has declined in 2 quarters in a row. Now, it's not exactly completely declining in all these quarters, but for the majority, that gray area is all an economic decline or a recession. In fact, I think they call it the Great Recession. 2008 Q1 to about 2009 Q3, somewhere around there. From 2005 to 2015 Q4, you're looking at a $2.5 trillion difference. The change between where the recession started and the recession ended was about $600 billion difference, just to give you some idea. Now the GDP alone doesn't really tell you a whole lot. So this is our grade for the American people, for the output of all things in America. This doesn't tell you much because what really matters is the growth. You can see we're growing from that where the recession ended around 2009 Q3. We're growing, and we're growing at a pretty steady rate. That's a good thing. But now we have a graph, this next one, it's called the growth rate of real gross domestic product. Anyways, this is the percentage change from quarter to quarter. And what you're going to notice is on the far left, before 2008, you're all positive numbers. You've always grown since 2005 to basically 2008. You can see some of it trending downward, and then of course you hit the gray area, and that's the recession. And as you can see, those are negative growth rates. So when you have a negative growth rate, your actual dollar value of the GDP is also going to decline. So that's what happened between 2008 and 2009, or a roughly 2-year period almost. But as you can see, when we got out of the recession, we've been mostly positive growth rate since then, with a couple of spikes below the 0 point. This data comes from BEA.gov. Now we're looking at the jobs added by month. This comes from BLS.gov, Bureau of Labor Statistics. On the left-hand side, before the recession, you see that there was jobs added in roughly around the 200,000 range. So for every quarter, they've been adding 200,000 jobs up into the recession. As you can see, the recession, it dwindled down and we lost lots of jobs. That correlates with the recession and all the other graphs I've showed you so far. And then, of course, after the recession, job growth started occurring again. As you can see, roughly around April of 2010, it's been a positive job growth since then. The unemployment rate versus labor force participation rate. This one's a little bit hard to grasp at first because a lot of people think that unemployment rate, just that number alone, is worth something. It's not. Without the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate together, you really don't have a picture of the full story. Let me explain. The red line here in this graph is the unemployment rate. And as you can see, during the recession, the unemployment rate goes from somewhere around 4.5 all the way up to about 9.5% unemployment. The left-hand axis describes the unemployment, the red line. The right-hand axis describes something called the labor force participation rate, which was pretty steady before the recession. And then as the recession happened, you can see it kind of slowly went downhill from there. Now, after the recession, you see the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate are both kind of parallel. They're going both downward. They're sloped downhill. So what's going on here is the labor force participation rate. That is defined as those that are already employed and those that are unemployed. Now, the key thing here is the word unemployed doesn't mean you're just don't have a job. It means that you don't have a job, but you're actively looking for a job. If you're not actively looking for a job, you're not part of the labor force. And that happens all the time. So people lose interest in trying to find a job. They just give up altogether. They go live at home. They find other ways, whatever it may be. So the fact is, after the recession, you see unemployment dropping, and you would think at first glance that's a good sign. So unemployment dropped from, like I said, 9.5% back down to maybe 5% roughly in 2016. However, the labor force participation rate also dropped. What that means is people are dropping out of the race. They're no longer even looking. They gave up. So things are not looking that great. However, somewhere around July or October of 15, the participation rate is starting to rise, and we'll see what happens. Most likely we're going to be in an economic growth period. Let's hope so. But this chart right here shows not growth, even though unemployment went down. Key thing there. Total jobs by month. This is from the BLS.gov as well. This is showing you how many jobs total in America there were during these time frames. Now, the only thing here that's important is during the recession, you can see the jobs dropped from roughly 137 million down to about 129 million. And then, of course, it's steadily increasing again. All this data is from BLS.gov. Now we have the Consumer Price Index. And it's called CPI-U because it's urban. They have a CPI that's there's so many different consumer price indexes out there, but the U stands for urban. And why we use that one most often is because 87% of all the population in America live in an urban area. The Consumer Price Index, what it really is if I bought a basket of goods back in 1999 for $100, because this is based off a 1999 baseline. So if I bought a basket of goods, medical care, transportation, some food, whatever you normally use day to day, there's a basket of goods out there. It cost $100 in 1999. Now, this is also taking inflation in account, so it's not going to overstate anything here. So if you look at January 16, we're all the way up to like $135 basically. So that same basket of goods costs $135 today. That's adjusted for inflation. So therefore, what you're getting is less. So you're paying $135 for $100 worth of goods back in 1999. It's not a good thing. Now the Index of Consumer Sentiment, you get that from the University of Michigan. They release this I believe monthly. As you can see on the chart, that the sentiment, which means how do people actually feel about their future purchase habits, the future economic, uh, what do they think is going to happen in the future? Are you going to buy a car? Are you going to get a loan? You're going to get a mortgage? What do you plan on doing? Do you plan on saving money instead? Well, what happens is the University of Michigan actually physically calls, I think 5,000 people as a sample survey, and they ask them these questions. What do you plan on buying in the future? How do you feel about the economy in the next 6 months? Things like that. So what you see here is kind of steady on the left-hand side, a little bit, jagged, but above the, 70, almost above the 80 point line. The numbers don't matter. Just look at the difference between before and after the recession. So we have the recession, we're above the 80 line. You have the recession, you're down in the 50s, and sentiment didn't really rise that quickly. In fact, we're not even at that 100 mark, which this is based off of a 100 from, I believe, 1984 standard. So we're actually less sentiment about our future today than we were in 1980s. Let's just put it that way. What this is probably a lagging indicator as well, because most of the time your sentiment to buy something in the future is based on what the economy has already done. So if I lost my job 6 months ago and I still don't have a job, I'm probably not going to go put out try to get a loan for a car or a mortgage. That's just not going to happen. So this is kind of a lagging indicator, but put this tool in the toolbox and combined you'll get some better data. Here we go, next chart. Okay, so I'm not going to take any questions because this is online, but I will say take the economic indicators into consideration. Take that ammunition, bring it to your leadership, your management, maybe you own your own business. Respond to the indicators because the indicators are a direct relation to the market that's about to happen. With that being said, thank you for watching this briefing.